Welcome to Spooky Saturdays. I am your hostess, the Reading Dragon. Tonight, we have a tale by Chad P. Brown. We hope you're comfortable and ready for a chill. The Basement. As soon as Heather walked into the Blackwell house, she realized she'd messed up. Every kid in town knew the house was haunted. Hell, even some of the adults would fess up and admit it. 30 years ago, Frank Blackwell sliced his wife's throat in the living room and then hung himself from the rafters in the basement. No one knew why he did it, but everyone swore the basement floor was stained crimson from the blood from dripping down between the floorboards. Since then, no one had ever lived in the house longer than a couple months. Their brief residency wasn't due to the faulty wiring or the poor insulation or the drafty windows or even the old plumbing. No, everyone had moved out because creepy stuff just happened in the Blackwell house. But Heather didn't let any of that deter her. Marie and Teresa, her best friends, had dared her to go inside. There was no way she could let them think she was a chicken, especially when they'd claimed to not only have gone inside the house, but down into the basement as well, the most haunted part of the Blackwell home. Heather seriously doubted her friends had stepped inside the Blackwell house's infamous walls, and she doubted even more anything was going to happen to her. But as soon as she opened the door and stepped inside, she knew she'd messed up. The doorknob was ripped out of her white-knuckled grip, banging shut behind her as she was forcibly dragged into the house. She screamed for Marie and Teresa to help her, but her cries were swallowed by the walls of the monstrous house. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. She grabbed onto the doorknob harder and frantically twisted it back and forth. But the house was still sealed shut like a tomb. She gave up and cautiously backed away from the door. Heather turned around. Her eyes darted around the room, expecting some ghost or ghoul to drag her down into the hellish darkness of the house. She was just as petrified as she'd been when she was 3 years old. She would stare, wide-eyed, at the closet in horror, afraid some monster would jump out any moment and pull her into the abyss hidden inside her closet. She'd forgotten how that childhood fear had felt, but now she was drowning in it. She jumped when she heard a creaking sound to her left, her heart trip-hammering inside her chest. She spun around and discovered a mouse skittering across the floor. She was terrified of mice, but it seemed less scary than the horrors which plagued her mind right now. Giggling nervously, she felt ridiculous for being so jumpy. She took a few deep breaths and tried to calm down before deciding to prove to herself that she didn't have anything to be afraid of in this house. Heather crept forward, noticing how the front room was empty. According to the story she'd heard, the last residents had fled the house in the middle of the night. But evidently, they hadn't been so frightened as to leave their belongings behind in their haste to escape. Maybe the Blackwell house wasn't as sinister as everyone claimed. Every town across America had at least one haunted house. They'd become a staple of society, as common as the corner market or side of the road gas station. But that didn't necessarily mean all haunted houses were really haunted. Heather was comforted by this thought as she passed from the front room into the adjoining room. Despite the dire situation of being trapped inside the house, she tried to rationalize the situation. She had no problem conjuring how the dilapidated door had lodged into the doorframe after a violent gust of wind had yanked it out of her hand. She also convinced herself that the same wind had blown her into the house with its sheer force. But her fear impeded her from recognizing the irrational logic she was using to conjure up a wind that had to be simultaneously blowing into and out of the house in order to bring about her horror movie entrance into the Blackwell house. Heather glanced to her left and saw an open door with a flight of descending stairs. The basement. Her first instinct was to just get the hell out of the house. Staring at the doorway, her mind bypassed its previous logical and rational line of thinking and clamped onto the primordial and instinctive emotion of fear instead. She had no idea what was waiting for her down there. She'd never seen a ghost, but that didn't mean they didn't exist. And if a ghost was down there, she was willing to bet it wasn't any Casper the Friendly Ghost. But she found courage in the fact that she'd never heard of anyone dying inside the house, other than the Blackwells. Yes, it was supposedly haunted, and yes, people swore they'd seen ghosts, but those ghosts had never killed or even harmed anyone. Heather steeled her nerves and prepared to go down into the basement. As she timidly walked down the flight of stairs, she started counting each step. It was a peculiar habit she'd had ever since she could remember, and half the time she didn't even realize she was doing it. Her descent seemed like an eternity as the air around her grew darker and heavier. Even though she knew they were coming, she jumped every time the steps creaked underneath her feet. Not sure if she could take any more, she considered once again getting out of the house. Refusing to turn back, she continued down the stairs, hoping the worst-case scenario would involve her falling and breaking her arm. With every tentative step, she kept counting and praying she hadn't made a mistake by deciding to go down into the basement. To her dismay, she reached the bottom of the stairs when she'd counted 34 steps. Confused, she turned back around and looked at the stairs. The normal-looking flight of stairs couldn't contain more than 15 steps, but she'd clearly counted 34 steps. She recounted the steps and discovered there were indeed only 12 steps. Heather immediately felt like she was going to choke, the phrase she'd used for throwing up when she was a little girl, as a terrifying and creepy sensation crept up her already frightened body. Her mother had been 34 when she died. An unwanted scene flashed through Heather's mind as she stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, an event which she'd fought to suppress over the course of the past year. She was standing at the top of the staircase in their old house. Her mother was in front of her, screaming at her about how things were going to change. She was yelling back, reiterating how she was 14 now and wasn't a little kid anymore. They continued arguing, their faces inches apart as they spat out stinging words that neither one of them meant. Heather telling her mother that she hated her, while her mother was calling her a spoiled brat. She was growing tired of listening to her mother treat her like a baby. She turned around to storm off to her room, but her mother grabbed her by the arm and told her that she wasn't done talking to her. Then, her mother shook her by the arm, informing her that she wasn't going to disrespect her like she'd been doing recently. Overbrimming with anger, she forcefully yanked her arm out of her mother's hand and started to stomp up the stairs to her room. But she stopped when she heard a scream followed by a loud thump. She jerked around to see her mother already halfway down the stairs and falling fast. When she hit the floor, head first, the blood pouring out of her head turned her mother's blonde hair into a sickening crimson color. Heather remained frozen in shock at the top of the stairs, unable to help her motionless mother. When she finally realized her mother was dead, she tried to scream for help, but the cry remained locked in her throat, refusing to comply, and all that escaped her lips was the silent air forcefully expelled from her lungs. Heather felt a cold chill crawl up her spine as her mother's death came back to haunt her. For the past year, she'd been able to keep those horrifying images locked away, refusing to let herself relive that horrible accident. She immediately blamed this cursed house for dredging up that fatal night. Heather stood at the bottom of the staircase, surrounded by darkness, trying to decide what she should do. The flashbacks of her mother's death had frightened her more than if she'd seen Frank Blackwell's discolored and bloated body hanging from the rafters. She decided to go back upstairs and find a way out of the house. She'd more than proved to her best friends, as well as herself, that she wasn't afraid to go into the basement of the Blackwell house. But she'd done it at the price of resurrecting the repressed memories of her mother's tragic death. "Time to get the hell out of here," she thought, as she started walking back up the stairs. When she heard the scream of her mother, Heather thought for the second time how she'd messed up by coming into this house. She forced herself to look at the top of the stairs. An expression of disbelief, mixed with terror, swept across her face when she saw the thing which had once been her mother standing in the doorway. Her mother's skin, which had always been smooth and white as porcelain, was now a grotesque mosaic of decayed black, brown, and gray flesh, peeling away in some areas, while it had rotted off completely in others. Her once warm and pristine smile was now a fiendish snarl full of rotting teeth. She held her long and blackened fingernails in front of her like claws, ready to rip into something like a wild animal. Heather could even see dried splotches of blood in her mother's filthy, matted hair. "Mom?" As soon as the word was out of her mouth, Heather regretted having said it. There was no way possible this thing could be her mother. But when it spoke to her, Heather heard the voice of her mother as clearly as she'd heard it all of her life up until that tragic day last year. "Heather, honey, Mommy doesn't want to fight with you anymore." There was a sweet and pleading tone to her mother's voice. It made Heather's skin feel cold and clammy, like slugs were crawling all over her flesh. Her mother stepped down the stairs, flexing her claw-like hands and licking her rotted lips with her black, swollen tongue. Heather ached to run away, even if it meant dashing headlong into the unknown darkness of the basement. But she couldn't move. She was frozen with horror, just as she'd been when her mother had accidentally fallen down the stairs. She begged her legs and feet to move, but they spurned her pleas, remaining locked in place, as if trapped in a block of cement. "Why do you want to run away from me, Heather?" Heather could now detect a hint of hatred laced with mockery in her mother's voice. "Mommy just wants you to know I'm not mad at you anymore, baby. Even if it was your fault when I fell down those stairs and cracked my head wide open, Mommy's going to make it all better." Her mother stopped about halfway down the stairs, licking her lips as phlegmy spittle mixed with blood seeped out of her mouth. Heather could see the bestial ferocity building up in her mother's bloodshot eyes, reminding her of the rabid dog she'd seen in the movie Cujo. But even that wasn't an accurate comparison to the raging fiend in front of her now. "Do you know how Mommy is going to make it all better, you little bitch?" her mother hissed at her. "I'm going to rip your disrespectful body to shreds and then feed on your matricidal flesh." Her mother let out an eerie, ear-splitting shriek as she leapt forward. Heather screamed as her body was paralyzed with terror, unable to break free from the grave her body would soon become. With her mother inches away from ripping into her, Heather's face was splattered with bloody phlegm as the rancid stench of her mother's rotting body violated her nostrils. She squeezed her eyes shut, once again reminded of how she used to shut her eyes when she'd been a little girl lying in bed, afraid to look out into the darkness because of the monster waiting to reach out and grab her. And now that monster was her mother. Quivering, she waited helplessly for her mother to begin tearing into her flesh. But the monster didn't rip into her. The seconds crawling by seemed like days. Heather was too terrified to open her eyes to make sure her mother, or the thing she thought was her mother, was gone. After a couple of minutes, she finally opened her eyes, her body still shaking uncontrollably. Her eyes darted around in the darkness, searching for any sign of her mother. But she wasn't there. Before her brain even had time to consider the idea of escape, her legs and feet moved of their own accord, and she was running up the stairs, too terrified to look back. She reached the top of the stairs, spun around, and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed throughout the mausoleum-like house. She leaned against the door, her breathing rapidly increasing, her lungs screaming out for air. Within seconds, she was hyperventilating and felt like she was going to lose consciousness. Heather dropped down to her knees, placing her hands on the door in front of her for support. As her body fought to ward off the attacking panic and stress, she started crying as her mind confronted its own assailant, the guilt over her mother's death. She tried not to blame herself, but it was useless. She knew that, even if it had been an accident, she had indeed caused her mother's death. As she knelt on the floor in the black well house, weeping hysterically, acceptance steadily replaced the guilt until she finally realized she needed to deal with it rather than hide from it, like she'd been doing the past year. If she didn't move past her guilt, then it would devour her, just as the phantasmagoric apparition of her mother had threatened to do so moments ago. Heather wiped the tears away from her face as the hyperventilating subsided. She wondered how long she'd been trapped inside this house of hell, confronting her own demons. She didn't know if the house was haunted or not, but she knew, without a doubt, that she'd dragged her own ghost inside with her, a ghost which she'd finally put to rest. As she slowly rose to her feet, she considered how this house had brought her peace of mind and acceptance rather than evil and death, since it had allowed her to come to terms with her mother's tragic death. Heather turned around to leave. Her exit was brought to a dead stop by her mother, grabbing her by the throat and pinning her against the door. "You always were a foolish little girl, honey," her mother hissed at her. As Heather felt the claws of her mother's hand ripping into her chest, she had to agree. Only a fool would come into this house. We hope you enjoy the story. If you like this telling, please hit the like button and subscribe to receive more content. When you subscribe, be sure to hit the notification bell so that you can be notified as to when I have a new story to tell.